Now we come to our text for this morning, and we're going to look at the story of a man named Mephibosheth. That was his name. What were his parents thinking? Mephibosheth. He's one of those little characters that you often find sort of penciled into the margin of the Old Testament. You know, there are these little people with their unpronounceable names, and they sort of step on the stage, say a few words, then they disappear. But in the case of this little man, Mephibosheth, you're going to find that he gives us a huge glimpse into the vastness of God's love. It's the first in our series called Heroes Without Halos, is King David. Other than Jesus, David is the greatest figure of all the Bible. In fact, today, if you go to Jerusalem, the main drag through town is King David Avenue. Swankiest hotel in all of Israel is King David Hotel. As a Gentile, you don't usually have to cover your head with a yarmulke going any place except if you walk into the tomb of King David. And you wonder, who is this guy who is still getting hero worship like 3,000 years after he died? And if you're going to grasp the impact that King David had in his day, you would almost have to create a fantasy figure. I mean, just think about it for a moment. You would have to wrap into one person the athleticism of LeBron James, the poetry gifts of Shakespeare, the military prowess of General Patton, and then throw in the spirituality of Pope Francis, wrap it all in one titanic personage, and then you put them in charge of running the whole country for 40 years. And yet the greatest thing is what we read in 1 Samuel 13:14, where it says that David was a man after God's own heart. It doesn't mean David was perfect. David was a hero without a halo. You may remember the certain little incident known as the Bathsheba affair that almost brought him down. But when David was on his game, when David was at his best, in David, you got a glimpse into the heart of God. And that's what we're going to get this morning as we look at this kind of obscure story about this guy with this tongue twister name, Mephibosheth. And we're going to look at 2 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 through 13. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan, and he is lame in his feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodabar." So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth, at your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said. We're going to come back to that later. "Don't be afraid, Mephibosheth, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. That's a lot of folks to sit at your table. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever the Lord the king commands his servants to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. So one day out of the blue, King David just says, "Hey, is there anybody out there who is still around from the house of King Saul, of the family of Jonathan?" And then just 2 verses later in verse 3, he says, "Is there anybody out there from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Kindness, I just got to tell you, kindness is kind of a wimpy word for one of the greatest words of the Bible. This word that is translated kindness here, then I would find something better to translate it, but it is the Hebrew word hesed. And remember that, H-E-S-E-D. Hesed And what hesed is God's super love. In fact, what agape is to the New Testament, hesed is to the Old Testament. It's often translated in the Psalms as steadfast love or covenant love. It is open-ended, unconditional, selfless, giving love. You say to somebody, all I am is all for you, no matter what. And David says, I want to show God's super love to somebody I have never even met before, and I want to give them the wealth and blessings of my kingdom. Now, if that shocked people back then, for people like us today, I think it has to almost feel like it's something that sort of fell out of Mars down to Earth, because we normally don't love people with hesed, with covenant love. Most of us enter into what you might call retail relationships. What we say to people is, listen, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. If you meet my needs, I'll meet your needs as long as this thing works for me. We don't say all I am is all for you no matter what. We enter into retail relationships. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. And there's nothing sinful about it. In fact, you got to have those relationships in your life. I'll give you an example of a retail relationship. Just suppose you get tired of doing your yard work and you talk to the teenager down the street and you say, hey, listen, I'll pay you if you come to my house every Saturday and you mow my lawn. And man, it turns out this kid is a go-getter. I mean, it's unbelievable. Like clockwork, every Saturday morning, the guy's there, and every grass clipping is put inside a hefty bag, and it's tied up, and it's put out there on the curb, and you're just going, this is too good to be true. And so you set up this kind of electronic transfer, from your bank account. $100 a month goes to this young man, $25 a week, because, man, this is working so well. Well, then something happens. The kid turns 16 and gets his driver's license. Oh, brother. Okay. Next Saturday comes, first time he's not there. You're going, you got to be kidding me. And then the next week you see him driving down the street. Actually, you hear him driving down the street, blasting the speakers, Wiz Khalifa music, just blaring out, boom, boom, boom. And you say, well, okay, I get it. Let him get it out of his system. But then the next Saturday, he still doesn't show up. And then next time he's got some girl next to him. And you're going, man, he's paying for his gas with my money. He's not mowing my lawn. Okay, bring him in. You sit him down. You say, listen, dude, either you mow my lawn or this is over. And that's a retail relationship. In a retail relationship, you are willing to sacrifice the relationship in order to meet your needs. But when you're in a covenant relationship, you sacrifice your needs in order to keep the relationship. And you'll stay in that relationship even when your needs aren't being met. Of course, the ultimate human covenant relationship is marriage, where you say, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, as long as we live. A retail relationship dies on the altar of covenant love, because covenant love transcends all changes in time and circumstances. Trying to explain this, believe it or not, one of the great examples of this love I'm trying to describe I've seen in my life was for a dog. And it really wasn't a very nice dog. Years ago, when our kids were young, we went down to the pound and we got Checkers. And we brought Checkers home. And soon after we got Checkers home, Checkers turned nasty and snappy. And beginning to the end was one breakfast. I dropped accidentally a piece of bacon on the ground, and I bent over to pick it up. And as I did so, hurtling through the air was this dog. It just tore into me, actually broke the skin, bit me and broke the skin. So for me, he's not meeting my needs. He's out of here. It was like, this is it. And my kids started crying and everything. And it turned out there was a friend of ours who told us about a pet therapist. There was a certain kind of person, a therapist, that will come to your house and help you work through your pet issues. And so we staged an intervention with Checkers. And we had several sessions with Checkers. And after we figured, okay, we worked through our stuff, got it out on the table and everything. And so, okay, we were going to keep going. Well, now so we get that done with, and Checkers bites me again. And I say, okay, that's it. Kids, my 3 daughters, I say goodbye to this dog. Tomorrow, I'm taking that dog down to the pound. So say goodbye. Well, there was this sobbing, crying like that was Lassie that saved their life or something like that. And I said, but tomorrow, it's over. And the next morning, they went off to school crying, and I went off to work, and then I came back late in the afternoon, took Checkers in the car, drove off to the pound. There was only one slight problem. It was Friday, and I got caught in rush hour. By the time I got to the pound, it was closed. Now, Put yourself in my shoes for a minute and realize the dilemma I'm in. I now have to drive back home with that dog back into my family. And if you know anything about female emotions, it was now the equivalent of a Supreme Court pardon for the dog. Well, my wife is brilliant. She went online and she found a dog rescue organization dedicated solely to that breed of animal. She gave me the number. I called those people. 2 hours later, two people are standing right on our doorstep. And they're just pumped. They're going, where's Checkers? Where's Checkers? They literally said, we just built 4 kennels into our bedroom wall, and we've got them filled with this kind of terrier, but we got 1 left for Checkers. I avoided eye contact with these people. Finally, I said, great. Oh, sorry to see you leave Checkers. They take off with Checkers. Checkers was still a jerk. And I'll tell you this, Checkers only lasted 1 month with those people. And for the next more than 2.5 years, Checkers bounced around from family to family of members of that dog rescue breed organization all over the United States. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, because every time Checkers moved, they had to call for Checkers medical records, and our vet had to call us to give permission to release the medical records. So we got a call that said, Checkers is now in Tallahassee. Checkers is now in Reno. Checkers is now, I'm not kidding, Dallas. And the last one was Checkers is now in Chicago. And so relentlessly, indefatigably, people embrace this dog with covenant love. And you know what? That's good because when we're kind to animals, we glorify God. But then my thought was, how many human beings get love with that kind of relentless love? Aren't most of our relationships disposable? You're not meeting my needs? Well, I'm out of here. Or you're out of here. The more you put your own needs at the center, the more disposable your relationships are. And you know how you can tell if you're that kind of person? You have lots of exes, ex-friends, ex-dogs, ex-colleagues, ex-churches, ex-spouses. You say, well, why? Because my needs weren't being met, and so I needed to go someplace else. The thing about retail relationships is you're always on the surface. You're always looking for a better deal. You never commit. You're always keeping your options open. I love this comment by a professor of English at the University of Virginia, Mark Edmondson. He says, my students are possibility junkies. They always strive to keep their options open, never to shut any possibility down, which means they cannot commit to one thing. He said, ask an American college student what he's doing on Friday night. Ask him at 5:30 on Friday afternoon. I don't know, will likely be the first response. But then will come a list of possibilities longer than a Chinese restaurant menu. The concert, the play, the movie, the party, the stay-at-home chilling, the monitoring of Sports Center, the read fast a few assignments. And once you do get somewhere, wherever it might be, you find a student at a party, about 1/4 of the people have their cell phones to their ears. And what are they doing? They're talking to their friends. Talking about what? Another party they might consider going to. Can you say commitment phobia? David says, I want to commit to somebody. And it's not somebody who's meeting my needs. In fact, it is somebody I have never met before. He says, you suppose there's a surviving member out there somewhere of King Saul's household? Well, instantly, his palace goes into a tizzy. And there are rumors flying everywhere. It suddenly becomes like one of those episodes of Game of Thrones or the Tudors or the Borgias or something like that. There was only one reason a king in those days would want to find the heir of his rival predecessor, and that would be to separate his head from his shoulders. Because the standard operating procedure when a new regime came into power was then to hunt down the remnants of the previous dynasty and find those people and wipe them out because every one of them represented a threat to the king. That's why Mephibosheth in our story, you may have noticed, he's on the run. He's in hiding. Can you imagine how terrified he was when the soldiers came knocking on Mephibosheth's door? And then notice when he gets into the palace, as we read a moment ago, what does David say to him? Do not be afraid. And then even so, it says in verse 8, Mephibosheth says back to him, I am a dead dog. And in the logic of that day, that's exactly what he should have been. David could have easily justified just slaughtering Mephibosheth right there on the spot in the name of political stability, to ensure the peace of his kingdom. But you know, covenant love doesn't just mean setting aside your own needs. If you're going to love with God's love, you have to take risks, and that means becoming vulnerable. And boy, does David make himself vulnerable in two ways. First of all, you notice what he does? The first thing he does is he gives Mephibosheth a power base, huge power base. He says, I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul. Instantly, Mephibosheth is a rich man, wealthy. And that's nothing compared to the next thing he does. David says to him, and by the way, I want you to become my son. I want you to come and eat at my table. Verse 11, Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. David says, Mephibosheth, you're not here to die, you're here to dine. And tonight at the dinner table, you're going to find a place setting with your name on it at the table engraved in gold. And then later tonight, you're going to find a monogrammed robe in the Lincoln bedroom waiting for you. Welcome home, Mephibosheth. And about this time, David's political advisors in the corners are going, oh no, the king has gone crazy. Your Highness, putting the heir of King Saul that close to the throne is just asking for trouble. The question now is why? Why would one of the most brilliant kings who ever lived do this crazy, irrational, risky, dangerous stunt? Well, one answer is that's just David. David, everything he did was bigger than life. He sinned big, he dreamed big, and he loved big. But the key to this whole story goes all the way back to that very first sentence. Remember that first sentence? It said, David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness? Why? For Jonathan's sake. You got to know about Jonathan. And he's the key to this whole thing. King Saul had already picked out his successor that was going to follow him, and that was his own son, Jonathan. But then the prophet Samuel goes over and anoints this shepherd boy named David to be the king. And Saul flies into a murderous rage, and his one goal is to do a manhunt and track down David and kill him. But the person who had the biggest reason for hating David was Jonathan, because his own throne was being stolen right out from under him. Jonathan is one of the greatest figures of the Bible. In fact, I think of him as the Christ figure of the Old Testament. Jonathan senses that God's anointing really was not for him, but for David. And just out of the blue, Jonathan decides to love David with covenant love. And there's a scene where Jonathan takes off his princely royal robe and he just flings it around David's shoulders. And he takes his sword and he gives it to David. And he wraps his belt around David. And it was him saying, David, I'm out of here. It's all yours. You're the king. And then Jonathan stays in his father's palace in order to be an insider to thwart all of the plot attempts to killing David. But eventually Jonathan has to go to war on the side of his father, and they end up out in this terrible battle that's a total disaster on a place called Mount Gilboa. The Philistines close in on him, and tragically, Jonathan and Saul are both killed in this battle. And David screams like a wounded animal. Here's what he says, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than the love of women. Everything David had in life, including his life, he owed to Jonathan and Jonathan's covenant love. And so how can we love with covenant love? It's very simple. We have to have happen to us what happened to David. We have got to have a friend who loves us with that same irrational, crazy, limitless, sacrificial, vulnerable love. And you know what? We do. And that's why we're here. And that's why we have this table that's here before us that we're going to come to in just a few moments. David had a friend who gave up his earthly throne. We have a friend who gave up his heavenly throne. David had a friend who put his royal robe around his shoulders. We have a friend who went to a cross that he might wrap us in the robe of his righteousness. Mephibosheth didn't deserve anything that he got, did he? Everything Mephibosheth got had already been paid for by Jonathan. You and I don't deserve this table. And yet here we are in the presence of a king who says, y'all come. I invite you to come, Jesus says to you this morning. And I've got a place setting at this table for you, and it's embossed in gold. I want you to become a child of God. David took a risk. Jesus took a risk of vulnerability to put him on a cross for you and for me. And now what he says to you and me this morning, finally, is what he says is, after all I have done for you, won't you now love with covenant love? Won't you hang in your relationships through the tough times? Won't I give you the strength to be able to hang on to that person I've given you to love, even when they're not meeting your needs? Can't you suffer just a little, like I suffered for you on the cross, for the sake of covenant love, that you might love with my hesed. You come to this table this morning, you're going to get God's super love, a love that is eternal, everlasting, unconditional, forever.